So on this slide, I've just put up a few of the landmarks in terms of important philosophers and movements since Descartes and Hume. And it's a little crazy to try to go through it quickly in a video, but one can always discuss ideas in a shorter or longer fashion. So I'll just do my best to kind of talk through them in the shorter fashion and leave it to you. If you find any of them particularly interesting or compelling, you can read more about them. So in the late 1700s, a German philosopher named Immanuel Kant began publishing about basically about the standoff between rationalism and empiricism. He thought that he had a very original solution to the problems that the rationalists and the empiricists were arguing about, that involved incorporating the strongest features of both. Basically, Kant's proposal was that all of our knowledge arises in conjunction with experience, so that experience is a necessary component in order for us to know anything. But that doesn't mean that our minds aren't contributing something to experience. In fact, they could be contributing a lot. And Kant argued that some of the things that our minds contribute to the experience that we have include space, time, and causality. So Kant actually argued that it's not even sensical to ask whether time or space exist apart from the world that human beings experience, because everything that we experience and everything that we can conceive exists within space and time. And that's a limitation that our own minds introduce to the reality that we experience, and that therefore that we can know. So Kant's picture, strangely enough, involved both experience, because there's a kind of input from the world, but also a lot of structuring of that experience by our minds, and a structuring that operates before we're able to access any of the contents of experience directly. So that it's like as soon as stuff comes in, it's immediately processed and organized in a certain way. And he had a method that he proposed of kind of reflection and reasoning about what kinds of basically like what kinds of structures could be imagined by us, which he asked the reader to carry out with him in the book, kind of like Descartes does in his Meditations, in this very famous book called The Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant. Kant argued that, again, a lot of our experience and our knowledge was contributed, the structure of our experience and our knowledge was contributed by our minds themselves. Now, after Kant, in Germany, there were a number of thinkers who were very excited and provoked by Kant's proposal for a resolution of this standoff between the rationalists and empiricists. They thought that Kant had sort of opened up a really deep perspective on what reality itself is and our knowledge and experience of it is. That was different from what had come before, and they tried to explore that further and basically kind of fix some problems that they perceived in the way that Kant had articulated his idea, and some of the details of the Kantian account. And this group of thinkers were called the German idealists, and the most famous of them today is Hegel, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and also a German thinker, writing about 10 to 20 years after Kant's major works were published, for a number of decades thereafter. And I'll just kind of talk about the German idealist idea through Hegel. The question that Kant had posed, as the German idealists understood it, was what part of the reality that we experience, what part of the reality that seems like the true reality to us, okay, is contributed by our minds rather than by some object that's just out there and is as it is, like our minds are somehow structuring our experience and our knowledge. And they're structuring it at a very deep level, if Kant is right. They're structuring it like even before we start to see a single thing or identify a single pattern between things. Our minds are already structuring that. And so the big question that's raised is, what kind of structuring is this that's going on? Are there different kinds of structuring that are going on? How can we kind of get a map of the different kinds of structuring that are going on, that our minds are conducting with the contents of experience? And you might think that today we should do this through psychology or neuroscience or something like that. That's not an entirely bad idea, but let me just point out that if our minds are structuring everything that they experience, then we are going to need an analysis that allows us to say how they are structuring even the contents or the objects of a science like neuroscience. We need to be able to see, like, we need answers to questions like, what is an object, or what is a cause, okay, that refer to our mind's own structuring activity. And there may be some neuroscientists that are engaged with those questions, but I think often what happens is neuroscientists tend to kind of assume certain features of an objective in external world, and then they describe correlations between brain structures in that external objective world. But what the German idealists were trying to do is they were trying to, as it were, go in, try to get an analysis of experience and knowledge from the inside, so that they were able to be able to see this structuring at the sort of most deep, at the deepest and most fundamental level of its operation. And Hegel's big idea about how to do this, one of his big ideas, was that the structuring is not something that is stable or consistent across all persons and across all time periods. In fact, there's historical variability in how the structuring works. So, and there's a kind of hierarchy for Hegel of types of structuring. So some types of structuring are more sophisticated, more advanced. They involve having negated a less advanced form of structuring. Negated meaning contradicted or found a problem with. And then the more advanced forms would be kinds of resolutions of problems in the less advanced forms. And he wrote a very famous book called The Phenomenology of Spirit, where he tried to basically give a map of all of these different kinds of structurings. I don't know if he would have said that it was in fact all of them, but he tried to give a map of like dozens of these types of structurings and show how that particular type of structuring would fail if it was pursued in a certain way. It would end up running into contradictions, into what you might call, and what have been called, internal contradictions of the position, contradictions that are internal to the position, and then would have to find a resolution of those contradictions that would arrive at a new position, which in turn could be shown to have certain contradictions and limitations, and would arrive at a new position. And so that progression through multiple positions like that, arriving at a better and better position, according to Hegel's account of it, was what he called dialectic. And he was naming that actually after what Plato calls dialectic in describing the fourth section of the divided line, the section that has to do with philosophy. So Hegel's view is a view of a progressive improvement in our contact with reality through a progressive sophistication and resolution of former problems in our mind's structuring of reality. Okay, so that sounds pretty complicated. Probably, I mean, Kant and Hegel are famous for being among the most complicated philosophers in the whole tradition. So I don't think I'll try to clarify it anymore. If it's interesting to you, exciting to you, great, you can pursue it. But there it is from me up to this point. Now, Hegel's position inspired a number of reactions, and I want to discuss just two of these. One is Marx, who is probably the most famous person to claim Hegel as an inspiration. Marx is said to have turned Hegel on his head. Why would that be? Well, Hegel, remember, had been talking about the kind of development of forms of consciousness through history. Marx had the idea that consciousness was not changing through history all on its own. It wasn't changing just through a kind of logical process of resolving contradictions, but that it was changing because, more fundamentally, because of changes in what he called the material conditions of society. So Marx is classified both as a philosopher and also as a historian and also as one of the first sociologists. And also as an economist. He became very interested in history and in economics as ways of explaining why humans think in the way that they do, but also why society has developed in the way that it has, and how it is likely to develop in the future. And of course, I think almost everybody knows who Marx is, or knows something about Marx's ideas a little bit, like the idea of communism and the criticism of capitalism. Marx wrote a lot more about the criticism of capitalism, about what was wrong with capitalism, or ways that capitalism was led to suffering for people, the ways that capitalism led to oppression and suffering. He wrote a lot more about that than he did about precisely how to fix the problems, which is, I think, worth remembering, because people often criticize him for not offering a good solution, but he, in some ways, was much more. He didn't really think himself able to offer a solution. He more thought of himself able to offer a criticism of the existing social order of his time. I mentioned that just a little bit of a defense of Marx in passing there. Whether you agree or disagree with Marx, I think it's hard to deny that he was a very sophisticated thinker, a very sophisticated philosopher and thinker. Another reaction to Hegel is offered by Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, and they start the tradition that is later known as existentialism. Basically, the objection here was to say that the total universal history of consciousness is in a way less compelling to us, less interesting and less important than an analysis of our own specific situation in whatever culture or whatever set of kind of individual, personal, and psychological problems or tensions we experience. And the idea of the existentialists was to come to an understanding of philosophical issues and dilemmas through a deeper analysis of first-person experience, not just the kind of abstract first-person experience of someone like Descartes in the Meditations, or even Hume when he appeals to our kind of first-person reflection in his book, but things like some of Kierkegaard's questions are like, how can I be a Christian? I want to be a Christian. How can I be a Christian when I also see all the evidence against my Christianity? So a kind of tension between faith and reason. Or with Nietzsche, a question about there are some interesting observations in Nietzsche about the way that an individual's position, way of relating to society, or sort of how they feel about themselves in society, can make a difference to what philosophical positions they're attracted by. So that if they feel weak and resentful, then they may be attracted to philosophical positions that cast the world as an illusion, because if the world is an illusion, then that somehow vindicates my own sense of weakness. And maybe if I'm weak in this world, but this world is an illusion, then in some other world I can be strong. So that's the kind of analysis that Nietzsche gave. Not the point there is to say that individual experience is more philosophically important, and the kind of concrete particulars of individual experience and the tensions that individual people feel is more important to the grand questions of philosophy than philosophy has traditionally appreciated or understood. And we'll see that theme come up again in Frantz Fanon when we read from Fanon. So these are just two examples of kind of reversals or oppositions to the Hegelian position.